Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall. Just kidding, but I do want to talk about this date that's presented at the end of The Shining, July 4th, 1921. I looked up the astrology of this and I thought it was really interesting. I'm not an astrologer, I'm swimming at the bottom of the Dunning-Kruger effect, but I still just want to show some interesting things. For the most part, I used AstroTheme, which is an astrology website that's available for free, and I find it pretty easy to use. So obviously I had the date, but I also needed a time and location. For location, I chose the Stanley Hotel in Colorado, which inspired Stephen King's Overlook Hotel. For time, I just knew it was sometime in the evening, so I picked 11:11 just to be corny because you can't have delusion without angel numbers. This is what I got initially. But I don't know if AstroTheme glitched or something weird happened, because when I looked it up originally, the ascent, the AC right below me, was at 29 degrees Pisces. But when I went to double check myself later, I put in the same information with the exception of the seconds, because I can't adjust that. But when I typed in the same information, it put the ascent at 0 degrees Aries. The ascent is what's rising in the east. So the ascent is either the final degree of the final sign of the zodiac, or it's the first degree of the first sign of the zodiac. So I decided to get a second opinion. I used Charts, which is an astrology app I really like, and I typed in the same information, and they put the ascent at 29 degrees Pisces. So that's what I'm gonna go with, and we're also in Pisces season, so it seems appropriate. The next thing I want to talk about is this gathering of planets in the 4th house of Cancer. Cancer represents the home, the moon, subconscious. So from left to right, we have the moon, which is at home in Cancer and represents the subconscious. We have Pluto, which represents transformation, Mars, which represents action, the sun, which represents consciousness. Next to the sun, we have Pallas Athena, which is a dwarf planet in the asteroid belt. It represents problem solving. And finally, we have Mercury, which represents communication, all within 9 degrees of each other. This is also a new moon, and your standard astrologer will tell you that new moons are a great time to start manifesting. This is kind of a side note, but Pluto wasn't discovered until 9 years later in 1930. I mentioned that Pluto represents transformation, but it also represents in modern astrology. However, before Pluto was discovered, Saturn was the planet of, and I'll get to Saturn in a bit. The next thing I want to talk about is this Venus in the 2nd house of Taurus. Taurus is the sign of the material, and Venus is the planet of beauty, pleasure. However, it can also be overindulgent. And I thought it was so interesting that Venus is at 27 degrees because at 26 degrees is the star Algol. Algol is a star system located in the constellation Perseus. Algol's actually 3 stars, but primarily it's these 2 stars, a larger dim star and a smaller brighter star, which are in close orbit with one another. The large star eclipses the brighter star every couple of days, which creates this blinking, dimming, brightening effect, giving Algol the nickname the Blinking Demon. Algol is also associated with Medusa, who turns her victims into stone. And I just think that's so interesting because Jack Torrance isn't turned to stone, but he does end up frozen by the end of the movie. Algol is also associated with the planets Jupiter and Saturn. So going back to our chart, we have Jupiter and Saturn in the 6th house of Virgo. Virgo is associated with the Virgin and also with caretaking. Jupiter is the planet of expansion and abundance. Saturn is a planet of discipline, karma, and before Pluto was discovered and took on that role. Saturn is also the father of Jupiter, and we all know that Saturn eats his children. This is kind of random, but I always find it really interesting that Saturn and Jupiter, their signs almost mirror each other. Like if you flipped them, they would look very similar to each other, if that makes any sense. But going back to Saturn, Saturn is Father Time, the Grim Reaper. His symbol is a stylized sickle. So in the Stephen King version of The Shining, Jack wields a croquet mallet. Croquet, a very frivolous game of high society. It makes me think of Alice in Wonderland personally. However, Kubrick changed the croquet mallet into an axe for the movie. An axe is a very practical tool and it's used for harvesting. I'd say it's like a cousin to the sickle. So I find all this astrology very interesting, but I needed to take a step back. But I kept thinking about all this. And then a couple of days ago, I was like, this takes place in Cancer season. What's the sign opposite to Cancer? That's Capricorn. What happens during Capricorn season? Christmas. Is there a Stanley Kubrick Christmas film? Yep, and it even includes some interesting parties. But even though Christmas is in Capricorn season, a lot of the buildup, the majority of the buildup happens during Sagittarius season. So I wanted to try to find out when exactly Eyes Wide Shut! When did Eyes Wide Shut take place? And luckily, someone from Reddit already asked that question. And someone came up with this answer. Diegetic indicators narrowed down the events of the film as beginning on the night of December 9th, 1996, a Monday, and ending in the morning of December 12th, Thursday. Mansion Party was Tuesday. The Kansas City Chiefs play the Oakland Raiders, which is what Bill should be watching on TV if Kubrick's legendary attention to detail holds true. And then this person down here points out that the 10th of December was a new moon. And so I double checked and Tuesday, December 10th, the day of the mansion party, was a new moon. 2 parties that fall on a new moon. And that made me wonder what exact days The Shining took place, and someone on Reddit already broke it down. So thank you, Reddit. And apparently the climax of The Shining happened December 11th, 1975. So the events of Eyes Wide Shut occur at the same time as the climax of The Shining, just 21 years apart. I'm definitely going to look at all these days astrologically, but I just want to focus on December 11th at 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. 8 a.m. marks the sun rising in the sign of Sagittarius in the east, and at 4 p.m. the sun would be setting in the west. And at the same time, we have Ceres, another dwarf planet from the asteroid belt, rising in the east. Ceres is associated with the harvest, and it's in the sign of Gemini, which is associated with the twins. And of course, I have to mention Saturn, which is right here in the sign of Leo. Leo is a very self-centered sign. It's represented by the sun. It's the gravitational force, the pull. It's also very ego-driven and can be very selfish. Me, me, me. Fun fact, Stanley Kubrick was a Leo. I'm running out of time, which is appropriate since I was talking about Saturn, the planet of time. There's way, way, way more stuff I need to look into and research, but I just wanted to share what I had so far. Astrology is not real, neither are movies. I just think astrology can be used to convey these very ancient themes and archetypes that still relate to us today. And I think that's kind of what Stanley Kubrick was doing. I don't know. That's all, folks. Da 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 da.